Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Evaluating Energy Efficiency Programs, Policies, Practices, and New Tools. We will discuss selected results from ACEEE's National Survey of State Policies and Practices for Evaluation, Measurement, and Verification, EM&V, along with tools and resources developed by E for the Future to support EM&V. My name is Rachel Gold of ACEEE, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping announcements. First, your screen is customizable. Feel free to make the various windows as large or as small as you would like. You can even minimize them to drop the menu at the bottom of your screen. Click through the widgets at the bottom of the screen to be sure you aren't missing any options available. Next, presentations can be downloaded as PDFs from the presentation list in the menu. Attendees are all in listen-only mode, but can submit questions through the Q&A box at any time during the webcast. The presenters will respond to questions throughout and at the end of presentations. The Q&A can be accessed in the menu at the bottom of your screen if it's not already visible. I'll note, since we always get this question, that we will share a link to the slides and the recording within the next day or two. And now, I would like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. They are Dan York, Senior Fellow at ACEEE, and Shayna Fiddler, Research Associate for Valuation at E for the Future. We'll also hear a bit from Julie Michaels, Director of Valuation at E for the Future. I'll start with our first speaker, Dan York, who is a Senior Fellow at ACEEE, engaged primarily in utilities and local policy research, as well as technical assistance. Dan focuses on tracking and analyzing trends and emerging issues in utility sector energy efficiency programs. Dan's going to share about ACEEE's recently completed National Survey of EM&V Policies and Practices, which updates a similar study completed by ACEEE back in 2012. The survey provides a picture of the current landscape of EM&V across the U.S., including administrative frameworks, program evaluation goals and requirements, and how evaluation results get used for decision-making. Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Rachel. And good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're located. Really happy that you could join us today for this little discussion. And as Rachel said, I was part of a team that conducted this survey, updating work we'd done before. And just off the bat, as a qualifier, I'm not an evaluator and I don't play one on TV, but I do very involved in tracking programs and looking at what's happening in the industry. So I was very happy to get involved in this. And the other researchers on this project were Charlotte Cohn and Marty Kushler. Charlotte will join us, I think, later for the Q&A session. Marty's at a meeting today. So to start with, so what did we want to do with this survey? And also note to everybody, fielding a survey 2 weeks before the country shuts down for a pandemic is not really recommended practice. But so let's just say we were throwing a wild curve, but it was surprising to us how everyone persevered, and in the end it all worked out. But it was a little difficult to launch this survey. But what were we trying to find out? One is really just to look at, first of all, how is program evaluation structured in the different states, who administers the evaluations, what kind of oversight it is there opportunities for stakeholder and public involvement as a way of helping transparency and trying to avoid bias. What are the goals and requirements for program evaluation? What specific evaluation practices are in place. This gets a bit deep in the weeds. Questions like evaluation's favorite, gross versus net savings. What other metrics are being used? What about free ridership and spillover and deemed and meter-based savings? Whole host of issues that come up with evaluation. And then once evaluations are conducted, how are those results being used? How are they used for making decisions about maybe program funding or the type of program, the scale of a program, what's missing, what could be improved? And then finally, what policy objectives are evaluated? I think as programs have evolved over the years, I think we're recognizing that they can it's more than just saving energy these days. We're worried about greenhouse gas emissions and energy equity and other policy goals related to programs. So evaluation is how we answer those kinds of questions. And so as was mentioned, this updates, we did a very similar survey in 2012, that one Marty Kushner led up. And pretty much, I wouldn't say this is a carbon copy because so much has changed, but we certainly looked at the kinds of questions we asked last time. And our goal was to get input from all states that have some type of customer energy efficiency programs funded through rate structures. And in the end, we got 44 states who completed the survey. There's 2 states that don't have such programs, and then we had some states we just couldn't get the survey completed. And so our primary contacts were regulatory staff. Secondary were key stakeholders. So if, let's face it, regulatory staff, we know they've got a little bit more on their plate than just worrying about a program evaluation. So it's sometimes hard to get the kind of responses we need, and perfectly understandable, but there's other people involved in program evaluation that are programs that we could task, and they were very helpful in helping us complete that. And then here is our little bit of an ace in the hole that saved us from asking even more detailed questions. And you'll be hearing more about this from Shana, is the database of screening practices, which provides a whole cornucopia of detailed data on cost effectiveness screening. So that was very helpful. So I'm just presenting selected results. The whole survey was, I think, over 40 different questions on any number of topics. So a lot in there. So I've been selective in picking out some things that I think are more general interest to a wider audience. So first, administrative framework for evaluation. So here's the question: are evaluations overseen by utilities, state commissions, or a separate entity? And you see that close to half are utilities. That means that the utilities are contracting and otherwise overseeing the evaluations. And the commissions are maybe a quarter there involved, and then scattering across some other categories there. So that's how they're structured at the broadest level. And then what's the role of the Regulatory Commission in program evaluation? And there you'll see in blue, 43%, a little less than half, that they formally approve the evaluation plans, so that the utility or their contractor or the program administrator submit them, and the regulators are looking that over and making sure that that's following practices established and whatever guidelines that state might have. And a small chunk there directly manages the evaluations. I think that's especially prevalent in places with statewide programs. Like I'm based here in Wisconsin, and we've got a statewide program focused on energy, and the regulators oversee evaluations and program administration. So, and this is probably no news to many of you, is that who actually conducts the evaluations, and really close to 80% are independent contractors. And so there's definitely a well-established practice of professional evaluators who perform most of this work. And then a small number by utility staff or state agencies. And then question, are evaluations done separately for each utility within a state, or are there's some kind of combined statewide basis? And again, 2/3 here, it's separately. Each utility is responsible for their own evaluations. Some statewide, but again, I think that steers towards those states that have some kind of statewide program or statewide coordination programs. All right, goals and requirements for program evaluation, and how are the results used for decision making? What policy objectives are evaluated? And again, this is looking at each state and how they use these evaluation results. Overall, almost all of them, there's some kind of, they certainly use them for general oversight. How are the programs doing? Are they reaching savings goals? Are they reaching participation levels that are desired? And any number of evaluation questions that get answered, and the results will inform stakeholders and administrators and regulators. Deciding to scale up pilot programs, I think that's clearly an effective use of evaluation. Before going to full scale, I think there's a lot of pilot programs are used. More and more, I think, compliance with state policy targets as states are adopting greenhouse gas reduction goals or clean energy goals. Other things that the evaluation can be used to answer some of those questions. And then here's one: eligibility or amount of shareholder incentive for utilities. Those states that have some type of performance incentive, shareholder incentive for program, for meeting goals, evaluation results can be used to determine the amount in some cases of that incentive. For planning purposes, the green bar there, integrated resource planning and so forth. So a lot of different uses of evaluation results. And where can those protocols for evaluation be found? In other words, what guides or guidelines are in place? And not surprisingly, not too many in legislation, but it's mostly in the regulatory domain. So whether it's a regulatory rule or order there, just slightly less than half, and then also slightly less than half the technical reference manual, 45% there. So those are clearly related. So by and large, it's the ways that evaluations are conducted are guided by their regulators, and it makes sense because it's a regulated environment. And we've got programs that are electric or natural gas or combined, but ask the question, are evaluation requirements for those natural gas efficiency programs the same as for electric? And 2/3 say yes, they have the same requirements, but maybe that might be a little bit surprising. 1/3 don't have quite the same requirements for evaluation. Specific practices in place for evaluation. This gets into the cost effectiveness tests to a large degree, and Shane is going to be digging deep into that one and showing you how these kinds of data are available in the database of screening practices. But here's all the different primary, or the cost effectiveness tests. The TRC, total resource cost, is dominant as the primary test used for program cost effectiveness. The utility cost test there in orange, much less so. The participant cost tests came in that no one uses as the primary one. But again, and you'll see there in a minute, that most states apply the different tests. They answer different questions. And the societal cost test is the 18 there. So the dominant tests are the total resource cost and the societal test, and just one with the rate impact measure. All right. And then in doing cost effectiveness tests, there has to be a determination of avoided costs. So how do they determine those avoided costs? You see there that energy and capacity market costs are dominant. Some states use the cost of a proxy power plant, kind of the theoretical, what plant would be built if we didn't do these programs, or looking at average system costs. And the other category, I guess, is the usual catch-all that some states do maybe a combination of things. Looking at the extent that savings are based on actual utility bills and meter data versus deemed values. You see that really 52% there sometimes use meter data, sometimes deem values. I think that's what that says is that you use meter data where you can get it and where it's not too difficult or just would be too time consuming, but they also use deem values, and those are certainly become more prevalent with technical reference manuals, and that saves everyone a lot of time and second guessing and questioning down the road. We all know that advanced metering infrastructure, smart metering is growing in uses across the country pretty rapidly. It's not everywhere by any means. And so that provides potentially highly granular data that can be used for program evaluation. And 42% of states say that they have conducted evaluations using that more granular data that gives time of use and location and really much greater depth of analyses are possible using that kind of data. But still, more than half still have not used AMI for evaluation purposes. So that's one of those emerging trends. And here's a question on, does your state use gross, net savings, or both? And there we saw more states this time around compared to 2012 are using both. I think that's just saying that they're maybe looking at different questions than in the past. Maybe some of that has to do with greenhouse gas reductions, clean energy goals. So there's greater use of both compared to the 2012 survey. And how do you determine that? And you see there it's across the board of figuring out what that net to gross ratio is determined, whether case by case, by state agency, in a technical reference manual, evaluation studies. So that there's clearly no one way to do this. And now just wrapping up here, some key findings. And again, this report's got a lot in it. So these are selected from the greater range of results that we report. So the one clear takeaway is just like programs that the evaluation of those programs and varies considerably from state to state. There's no single approach that's in place across most of the states. We all talk about each state being its own little experiment. And so, yeah, there's the differences in regulatory structure, the utilities, resources, stakeholder involvement, any number of things have affected how the evaluation is performed and structured. But that all said, that I think, and this is indicative of I think that most evaluations are done by contractors and they're relying on common methodologies and evaluation techniques. So there is a practice and kind of set of methodologies that are common despite or within that, the overall structure of evaluation. And again, it's because I think independent contractors perform that role. And PUC seem to be doing a little less in administering evaluations than what we saw in 2012, and utilities seem to have taken on more of that role. And here's, I think, an important one that we see in others is that most evaluation processes have some type of public involvement and access to evaluation reports. So let's see. And almost half the states use technical reference manuals. And nearly all states subject their programs to some kind of cost effectiveness test. And but we found that with demand response, not as prevalent. The 2/3 require those type of programs to be screened up based on cost effectiveness. And so far for customer renewables and storage, those are not so much subject to those same tests. a third, as we found. And again, there's a large increase in states using both net and gross, and it went from 21% back in 2012 to 43% in 2020. And let's see, so recommendations, final slide here. From what we saw, we think there's a lot of good work going on, and just to kind of do more of it, and good work going on, it means that there's processes and practices for independent, credible, and transparent evaluation. It's very integral to successful programs and improving them. That there's rapidly advanced technologies and analytics and metering capabilities, and those are offering, I think, new capabilities as well as new challenges for evaluators. We're asking different questions, trying to solve some different problems, using energy efficiency in more targeted ways, for instance, and trying the non-wire solutions, for instance. And then extending these evaluation methods to a wider range of distributed energy resources, to the customer-sided solar, perhaps, and whatever other distributed resources are becoming part of our grid. And again, the programs are being called to address more and more policy objectives, and some of those are non-energy related, whether it's energy equity, health, and environmental impacts. So it's another challenge for evaluators. Another one is valuing the time and locations of savings from energy efficiency programs. That's, again, becoming more important as we're trying to have more flexible loads. We're bringing on a lot more renewable energy, intermittent supplies. So that time and location value is becoming more and more important, and things like AMI is one way to help get at some of that. I think the TRMs are clearly well established, but they always need refreshing and validation and checking of results. As we get better and better data, they can be updated and improved. And then creating some kind of, there's still no national repository of evaluation reports, and that might help the practice and be a nice reference. So that's been a whirlwind tour through our research. Again, need to thank colleagues Charlotte Cohn and Marty Kushler for their contributions. And if you're interested in the full report, here's where you can find it. With that, back to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Dan. Now we'll hear from Shayna Fiddler, who works with the evaluation team at E for the Future on improving distributed energy resources valuation. Prior to joining E for the Future in August, she worked with the Northeast Clean Energy Council, the NECEC policy team, providing support for various renewable energy projects such as Vineyard Wind, the Smart Solar Program in Massachusetts, and a battery storage compensation program in Connecticut. Shayna will present and discuss resources developed by E for the Future to support and guide program evaluators. One of these resources is the Database of Screening Practices, which contains comprehensive data on cost-effectiveness tests used in each state. ACEEE relied on DSP for such data in our research. Another resource that E for the Future manages and supports is the National Standard Practice Manual for Benefit Cost Analysis of Distributed Energy Resources, which is just published this summer. Julie Michaels, Director of Valuation at E for the Future, will provide a very brief overview of this exciting new resource. Together, these tools are being used to improve the quality and consistency of energy program evaluation. Shayna, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon, everybody. Today, I'm going to be taking you through the National Energy Screening Project's various resources for providing support in state cost-effectiveness practices. So today, we'll be going through the background and the general purpose of the database of screening practices that ACEEE used in their report. This database was previously known as the Database of State Efficiency Practices, and I'll explain briefly why we changed the name in a few minutes. I'll be giving you a brief tour of the DSP and all of its features so people can more easily navigate the database. And I'll be explaining how ACEEE used the database to support their research and information sharing. Then I'll be turning it over to Julie for an overview of our National Standard Practice Manual. Julie, as well as various consultants and partners, make up E4the-Future's evaluation team, and we coordinate and manage the National Energy Screening Project. This is a project that aims to improve cost-effectiveness screening practices for multiple distributed energy resources. Resources in NESP are the Database for Screening Practices, the DSP, and the National Standard Practice Manual, the NSPM. As a whole, E4the-Future is a nonprofit. We work to promote clean energy solutions and advance environmental protection and economic fairness. The DSP was developed to support transparency in cost-effectiveness practices. We really want states to be able to see how other states and jurisdictions in the U.S. are handling cost-effectiveness, distributed energy resources, and energy efficiency programs. This can also help support states with the application of the NSPM framework by modeling their cost-effectiveness framework after what other states are already doing. This database was originally published in 2018 in Excel and then was migrated to Tableau in August 2020 in order to improve users. So this includes all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. In the database, there are a lot of different tools and tricks that we would love users to get to know in order to utilize the database potential. You can see all of the different kinds of cost-effectiveness tests that are being used in each state, as well as specific impacts that are in each test. You can see how these impacts are monetized or valued, and you can also see how all of this data was derived with links to supporting and documents that states have published. The advantage of having the Tableau format allows users to customize and download charts and tables in each of our tabs. So you can do it by state or by impact, and also choose multiple states or impacts to compare to each other. This data is all downloadable, as I said, in either an Excel spreadsheet layout or as a PDF. This is the first tab I'll be taking you through of the DSP. You can see at the top here we have a green bar with all of the different tabs in the database so you can get easily. Below, we can see a blue dashboard where you're able to view either electric or natural gas data, as well as data. So below you can see the table of different states and how they use each cost-effectiveness test. What I'm taking you through is the single state tab. This provides cost-effectiveness information by state, including any test information or impacts that are included. At this top dashboard, you'll also see the electric or natural gas view and different states that you want to select. The outputs for most of the impacts in the DSP will be say yes, meaning this impact is monetized and included in a study. No, meaning the study and not included at all, or broadly included. This means that the states have outlined in their policies that overall categories such as host customer, system, or social impacts have been accounted for, but the specific impact has not been listed in the policy. Next, the impact is really helpful for comparing impacts that are in each state. So as you can see here, primary test, for example, if you wanted to see how the total resource cost test is measuring their impacts, you simply select that from the drop menu and the bar graph will appear below. One of the most helpful resources of the DSP is being able to see where the data comes from. So if you were to roll over any output cell in the scheme, you'll be able to see the policy source where it comes from and the value source where the value has been outlined in state policy. You'll also be able to see if the state is currently using the NSPM framework, common definitions associated with each of the outputs, and you'll be able to download the underlying data at the bottom of the tooltip. Now, one thing to note about the DSP is that it's in gray font right now. We're working to improve the DSP as it's updated quarterly to make user-friendly changes. Also, we're currently dealing with a little bit of a lag when you are sorting the data in the DSP, and we're looking into working with Tableau on the back end to improve this. One of the most helpful tabs is the Impact Methods tab in the DSP. This shows how impacts are calculated or estimated. This data comes from an LB&L report that you can find on our website or in the DSP itself. There are 4 different categories of quantification that the report covers. An impact will either be monetized or added through a proxy, which deals with percent adders, alternative thresholds, and there's around 11 states included in this study. And at the top, you can see you can sort by impact and see which one you want to view. For example, in Maryland, we know they're using the total. Do include avoided ancillary services in their cost effectiveness. You can see that this impact is monetized using literature review.
Hi, Shayna. I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're having a little bit of audio challenges, so I'm wondering if you can turn off your video and close any other tabs. Apologies for the interruption, everyone, before we resume, because we're having just a little bit of trouble with breaking up in the audio.
How am I sounding now, Rachel?
Much better. Thanks, Shayna.
Okay, great. Continuing on, we can see that this impact is monetized through economic modeling and literature review. And lastly, rates a 4 on the transferability scale. The transferability scale is a really great way to see how impacts can be modeled across multiple jurisdictions. The lower your score on the transferability scale, the easier it's going to be for you to use different jurisdictions' impacts. For example, an impact that is stated across the U.S. will be easily transferable across multiple jurisdictions. Since this has a 4, it means that some of the modeling that went into the impact either has to deal with the specific population of Maryland, different rates, or different things to consider for that impact in Maryland, so it's more state-specific. You're going to need to tweak your numbers a little bit for you to use this impact for another jurisdiction. A little bit more about the DSP and how to use it. I'm going to be going through some of ACEEE's report results and showing you how they may have used the DSP to get this information. So the first chart that we have here is that you're showing primary cost effectiveness tests used by each state. As Dan had mentioned before, we see that the total resource cost test is used by many states, and the second most popular one is the societal cost test. So to find this in the DSP, you can either go to the Summary of States tab and click on each state that has the tests, or you can use the Maps tab, which will show you on a map which primary test is used by each state. In order to do this, select Primary Test at the top of the tab, and your map should appear. To sort by specific tests, you can go over to the legend and click on each test, and then it will show you which states use that test. Another example from EEE's report is the cost considered by number of states. So these are some utilities and some host customer impacts, and these are all fields in the DSP that you can sort by. Going to the Impact Summary tab, we're going to allow people to generate and download their bar charts. So if we're using all the impacts that were included in the last figure, we're going to go down to the field, drop-down menu, and select all of the relevant impacts that we want to see. And then you can see here that the output is a nice bar graph of how many states include these impacts in their cost-effectiveness studies. The DSP doesn't just have to be applied to evaluation. It can also be applied to other policy briefs or reports, such as this ACEEE policy brief on risk, reliability, and resilience. This is our Excel database version of the DSP, but you can also easily recreate this in the Impact Summary tab as well. I want to bring specific attention to the reduced risk and increased reliability impacts on the DSP. As many people have now been discovering, reduced risk and increased reliability are two very important elements to cost effectiveness. And as you can see here, not a lot of states are accounting for these in their cost effectiveness tests. So one of our goals in developing the D is to record which states start to use these, and hopefully the D will guide states to account for risk and increased reliability a little bit more in cost effectiveness. As I said before, we update the DSP quarterly, and we're always looking for feedback on user friendliness or any updates in information that we can find. So if you all want more information on the DSP, please visit the NEA, download the resources associated with the DSP. We have a user guide and related resources that have been compiled. Now I'm going to be turning it over to Julie, who's going to talk a little bit about the National Standard Practice Manual.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Shayna, for that presentation. And I just want to check audio with ACEEE folks. Make sure you can hear me okay?
You sound great, Julie.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Dan, for the overview of the ACEEE report, and to Shayna for the quick tour of the DSP. And apologies to everyone. The audio there was a bit choppy. We welcome questions, as Shayna said, on first we invite you to go look at that resource, and then we welcome any questions that may not have been answerable today for you. But related to this whole area of cost effectiveness is the work that E for the Future has been supporting around the National Standard Practice Manual. And if we go to the next slide, I really just have a few of them here. We've been hosting other webinars by different organizations in the past month and coming up in the months ahead, and hopefully you'll get a chance to check our website for other events for a deeper dive. But here's just a quick few key things to take away from this work we're doing on cost effectiveness guidance. So back in 2017, many of you may be familiar that we published the NSPM for energy efficiency. And with that publication, we've seen several states, many states interested in applying this new framework and from that NSPM for EE. And we have since that version to now be incorporated into this NSPM for distributed energy resources. So that was just published this past summer. And there's a short comparison here on what are some of the key changes, including some important terminology changes in terms of moving from this resource value terminology to more generally referring to there being an NSPM BCA framework, which includes principles and guidance on how to develop a primary test, as well as use of secondary tests. And the development of, by applying these principles, a jurisdiction can come up with what we're calling a jurisdiction-specific test. And we've now have 8 principles, building off of the 6 principles from the earlier version, and a multi-step process for developing a primary test, and importantly, guidance both on single and multi-DER analyses. And as you can see here, the new publication covers a broad range of distributed energy efficiency resources, including efficiency, demand response, distributed gen, storage, and electrification, including electric vehicles and building electrification. Next slide. So here's just a quick snapshot of the table of contents. And what's important here to see is that, you know, the foundation being offered here to help jurisdictions with benefit cost analysis is this framework. And Dan pointed out in ACEEE's research that most states require comprehensive cost-effective analysis for efficiency, but not so much for necessarily for other DER resources. And we're really hoping that this document can help jurisdictions apply a consistent BCA framework in looking at and valuing the different range of resources, whether they are a single DER assessment or some kind of multiple DER assessment. There really should be a framework that is fair and doesn't create bias towards any one resource in that valuation. There is lots of information in this document on DER benefits and costs. So the definitions, the range of utility and non-utility system impacts, importantly, cross-cutting issues. What are things that you need to think about when you're doing a multi-DER analysis? You need to, and what's involved in assessing cost effectiveness and the impacts that are associated with temporal or locational impacts, interactive effects across DERs. There's a whole host of things in that part 2 section of the guidance. And then, of course, there's a dedicated section on individual analysis of DERs, and then multiple DER analysis, including case studies for these different kinds of DERs, where the impacts really are going to vary depending on certain factors and use case assumptions. Things like technological, the operational profiles, the technology characteristics, the ownership of the resource, and who has control over the resource. That's especially the case for certain things like demand response and storage and the like. And then a whole lot of appendices with helpful background information and deeper dive into some of the topics. Next slide. So here you'll see, these are the principles, and I'm not going to go through them here for you today, but they should look familiar to those of you who are familiar with the NSPM for EE. We did add the 6th principle and the 8th principle, and I draw attention in particular to the 8th principle because this was a topic that came up in the NSPM for EE, and there was a dedicated appendix to differentiating between benefit cost analysis and rate impact analysis, and that they are both important, but that they are discrete and separate analyses that answer different questions. And it's particularly important in the context of looking at the host of DERs, because issues and concerns about rate impacts for other DERs, especially distributed generation, issues around cost shifting and the like, are very important, and many states are conducting value of DG and the like by doing rate impact analyses. And this document is really intended to help identify and ensure that jurisdictions are looking at these as separate but complementary efforts. And then, fundamental to this framework is applying these principles. And we've received if we go to the next slide here, you'll see here a map of all the states where there have been references made to the NSPM, and this is largely the NSPM for efficiency, but including some states that have already given, identified the NSPM for DRs as a resource they should be looking at. And importantly, what this tells us is that many states are really interested in the need for a framework. It's really a process that can help states go through a very specific steps with input from stakeholders, sufficient transparency, and using the principles to guide their process, whether they're reviewing their existing test to improve it, or whether they're starting, a process to build the test from the ground up based on applying the NSPM. So that process has been quite well received from commissions and commission staff. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to take a look at this document. Next slide just includes a link to where you can find this resource and other work, including the DSP work that is supported by E4the-Future. Thank you. Turn it back to ACEEE.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Julie, and thank you, Shana, as well. We'll now take some time with the rest of our 13 minutes together to address a few questions from the audience. If you have a question and haven't already had the chance to submit it, just a reminder that there's a Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Also joining our presenters for this discussion are Charlotte Cohn, who's a policy analyst at ACEEE and a co-author of the report with Dan and Marty, and in addition to Julie, Shana, and Dan. So I'll start off with a question, since we were just talking about the DSP, a question to Shana or Julie, which is, do you have specific definitions for each of the categories of benefits or impacts? For example, health and safety, satisfaction, and so on. How do you quantify those categories? Is there a specific type of assessment for each of those categories? So those are three big questions, but I think they'd be curious to hear a bit more about some of the categories and how you decided which categories to include and how those impacts are assessed.
Sure. So the short answer is yes. The DSP has a definitions tab, which does define all of these impacts and categories. So I would suggest looking at that to become more familiar with the impacts that we decided to include. The research done on valuation was not done by E4the-Future. We took from the LB&L report, like I said, which provides some but limited information on how impacts were quantified. Many of them are quantified through economic modeling or literature review. Yeah, Julie, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think generally it's just important to know that the definitions, as Shana said, are if you hover over a term, the definition is there. There's also a user guide, and it's tied to the NSPM. So the definitions for these impacts are linked to the if you will, the whole universe of the different type of impacts that one could account for. And very importantly, understanding the DSP is meant to create transparency so that you can find, if you see a certain state and that they've accounted for an impact, we may not have the direct information there on the methodology, but you can, through the resources and links, and in some cases they go to a TRM, but the intent is to be able to find some of the underlying studies and information so you can go more readily research and identify those assessment methods.
Thanks, Julie. And I'll just flag, we had quite a number of questions in the Q&A from folks about either definitions or places to get glossaries, or for people who are new to EM&V, how to get up to speed on the complex jargon of this area. So obviously the three resources that we highlighted on this webinar are resources that are intended to help with that. But I'll also flag the State and Local Energy Efficiency Action Network, the SEE Action Network, as another really great set of resources for those who are getting up to speed on EM&V. There's a whole series of reports there that are foundational and really supportive of the things that Julie, Dan, and Shana have talked about today. I'll pivot to a question for Dan. So you talked a bunch about sort of the structure and the oversight protocols. So what do you consider to be best practices for structure and oversight to make sure that evaluations are in fact independent and credible and useful? What are some of the things that states should be thinking about for structurally how they should set this up?
So I think the overall guide there is that there's opportunities for stakeholder involvement so that the evaluations aren't done behind closed doors, and whatever's done there is off limits to others who have interests and expertise in those things. So I think some of the best practices, I know in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, they've got advisory councils of multi-stakeholders that oversee, I think, a lot of the program development and implementation and evaluation, so that people know what's being evaluated, what approaches they're taking, results are open and subject to review and maybe revising. I think some commissions have in-house staff that are right up to speed and keep a close eye on evaluations. Others might hire an independent contractor to kind of watch what's going on. So it's just, I think it's, again, the key is open and transparent processes, and there are methods in place for addressing any issues that are raised. So if people question some results or a method that was used, that there's a way to work through that. So it's that kind of collaboration and open processes that seem to mark an effective evaluation. And then, of course, it's also just making sure that those evaluation results are used to improve or make improve programs or make key decisions on their future and size and scope and things.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. So we got an interesting question asking us if we could expand a bit on natural gas energy efficiency programs, how they differ from electric programs, what are some best practices to make them more comparable. I'll start with Dan to hear a little bit about, or Charlotte to hear a little bit about what was in the survey around natural gas programs. What did we ask? What did we learn?
Charlotte, you want to start that one off? Because Charlotte was our person deep in the weeds of the survey. So
Sure. Yes, absolutely. So we asked two questions, two yes/no questions about natural gas efficiency evaluation, and then one more general open field where respondents could go into great detail about how their state conducts natural gas efficiency evaluation. And what we found was that the majority of states have the same requirements to evaluate natural gas efficiency as they do for electric efficiency programs. 68% of respondent states said that it goes through the same process, while 32% of states had a different process. Of those states, the majority of them have the same cost effectiveness test applying to both natural gas and electric efficiency. But for the states where there is a difference, there were, as with many states, a wide variety of different approaches. to evaluating natural gas. For instance, some states don't require natural gas tests to undergo any type of cost-effectiveness testing. That may be because there simply aren't any natural gas efficiency programs in that state, or because the requirements and the scope at which they evaluate those programs is different from electric efficiency for a variety of reasons. Perhaps some customers in the state don't rely on natural gas, or there may be other reasons, environmental considerations, for instance, that factor into the difference in evaluation practices. But by and large, in the majority of cases, they're evaluated similarly.
Thanks, Charlotte. And I'll turn it over to Shana and Julie as well to ask, how many states in the DSP have natural gas energy efficiency, and what have you learned about how cost effectiveness testing differs from electric efficiency practice in those states? Any additional insights?
So the main difference between energy efficiency and natural gas cost effectiveness testing are, of course, the impacts that you're going to include in your cost effectiveness testing. With more focused on electric utility systems and impacts that they hold and operation and maintenance, whereas with the gas utility system, you're concerned about risk and reliability and the environmental compliance. So I would say that's the main difference between the two.
I will say, I will just add that I think Charlotte mentioned that, the approaches, the tests are often similar, right, within the jurisdiction, majority of the jurisdictions. And we just added natural gas information this past summer. And I confess, I have not gone and, we have not yet done, this is sort of now the fun stuff. You have the data, and now is the time to actually really evaluate and analyze the data and take a deeper dive in looking at some of the more specific comparisons in impacts and certain assumptions and what's accounted for where and based on what. Moreover, I will say in the NSPM for DRs, there's a whole section in Chapter 4 that looks at the specific types of impacts from the natural gas system one would look at, and in comparison to electric.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, everyone. I have one last question since we're getting close to time, and this is for whoever wants to take it. We talk a bit about in the ACEEE report about the importance of advancing approaches to value the time and location of energy savings. I'd love to maybe just hear from Dan about what that looks like, and maybe elaborate more on why that's important, and perhaps if there's time to hear from Shana or Julie about what that's looking like in the context of, and how that's talked about in the context of the NSPM. Dan, to start? Oh, you're on mute, Dan.
Did not hear me? My mic shows that it's...
I can hear you now, Dan.
Oh, okay. All right. I think two things are at play. One is the rapid growth of distributed energy resources, greater use of renewables on the system, and intermittent supplies. So that a kilowatt hour saved during some of those times of an abundance of renewable resources coming into the system that are cheap, that has a different value than an average kilowatt over the whole year. So that's a nuance that we're starting to explore. And then the other side of that, it would be time and location, as we use energy efficiency for more targeted distribution problems, the non-wires approaches to, or non-wires alternatives to building out infrastructure. And so where those savings occur will reduce the load appropriately for targeted geographic areas. So those are two areas.
Thanks, Dan. Julie, any thoughts on that question before we wrap up?
I would just add that take a look at that part 4 of the NSPM for DRs, which just goes into some more depth about examples of grid interactive building, case studies, a non-wire solution. And, there are illustrative examples. We plan to do some more deeper dive, if you will, with some real world examples in the upcoming year to apply these types of concepts and considerations. But yes, those are increasingly important when you're looking at buildings and the various resources that are at play within a building, and ensuring that we're accounting for the value streams of those resources, whether in a given location or a given time period, and the interaction of those resources. So it's complicated, but it's important, and we hope that the NSPM will help you and your jurisdictions in where you work to navigate these new areas.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. And thank you to all of our speakers for their presentations and to all the attendees for participating in today's webcast. We really appreciate it. All of the registrants will receive a link to the slides and to the recording. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day, goes forth and evaluates, measures, and verifies. Have a good one.